Blomcast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the second episode of the Blomcast, a podcast in which I will be looking at turning points in history. We are living at the greatest possible turning point in history today, a point in which one model is no longer working and another one is not yet established. I'm talking about the climate catastrophe, and that therefore seems particularly interesting to me to look at another case of climate catastrophe and see how societies reacted then. What I'm referring to is the so-called Little Ice Age, and in the last episode I told you what actually happened in the Little Ice Age and also what the reactions were that different societies had. And just to recap a little bit, it became colder in the world. I'm looking at Europe not because Europe is the only interesting thing in history, but because it is simply my speciality. I can know some of the languages, some of these societies. And also when we are talking about the climate catastrophe, the documentation of this catastrophe, both what happened in nature and how societies reacted, is particularly well researched and documented here in Europe. Therefore, I will be concentrating on that. And as I told you last time, between, say, 1570 and, say, 1680, you can also take a much longer term, but this was the culmination of this crisis. It became roughly 2 degrees colder, and that meant much longer winters, much harder winters, much shorter summers, many spoiled harvests, and a real emergency in what was then a late medieval Europe, creating failed harvests, famine, social unrest, inflation, and really a great crisis of the system. Also a system, of course, in which it was assumed that God and the faithful had a bargain, and as long as the faithful kept their part and didn't sin and prayed to God, God would keep his part, and that no longer happened. I also told you what the reactions were. I told you that they were praying and going on processions and listening to terrible sermons and self-flagellations, and indeed a wave of witch trials after every bad harvests, in which the so-called witches were accused of spoiling the harvest and making the animals sick and also sleeping with the devil. That wasn't a terribly efficient reaction to climate change, and it didn't help end the famines and the social unrest. But there were things that did, and this tipping point is what I want to talk to you about today. And this is quite possible to tell, or it's nice to tell you that in a study of 2 cities, you know Charles Dickens' novel, A Tale of Two Cities, that was Paris and London. Let's pick a different 2. Let's pick Madrid and Amsterdam. A curious couple, especially as Amsterdam was for a time actually a possession of the Spanish Habsburgs, but also because Amsterdam was, say, around 1500, a little city in which nothing ever had happened, and Madrid was the center of the greatest power the earth had seen. The Spanish Habsburgs, the empire in which the sun didn't set, as Charles V said. And Madrid was the center of this enormous power, and in this empire that spanned all the continents, enormous wealth was created by slave labor and brought to Europe, especially, for instance, the silver from the Peruvian silver mines. And Spain was powerful. It had the biggest navy. It went to war all over Europe. Nobody could challenge Spain's power and the Habsburgs' power. And when the Little Ice Age hit, it had a sort of paradoxical effect, like you see today when all of a sudden the US is buried under snowstorms while Europe is having unseasonably warm weather. Back then, also, the Little Ice Age didn't mean that it only became colder, and Spain especially had to contend with terrible droughts in the interior. You can see that when you read Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, the great novel, and Don Quixote, who believes to be a medieval knight and hallucinates himself into all sorts of situations, is trying to liberate a damsel in distress, a noble lady being carried away by robbers, and he attacks them. But of course what he's attacking is a group of peasants who are carrying a statue of the Virgin Mary to pray for rain. And this is the climate crisis for you. How did Spain react to the fact that its agriculture no longer worked well? It reacted by being more Spanish than it had been before, and that meant more hierarchical, more Catholic. So the taxes on the peasants rose, the princes insisted on their privileges, they instituted high taxes between the different provinces, so it was almost impossible to move produce economically, and certainly not possible to export it and to compete in a European market. Also, the purity of the faith became so important that after the Jews 100 years before, now also the Moriscos were kicked out of the country, and the Moriscos were the descendants of formerly Muslimic traders, Islamic traders, who had converted to Catholicism already generations ago, but were still regarded as not Catholic enough, and therefore now expelled from the country, and with them, of course, went a great part of the Mediterranean trading network they had had. And so Spain got into a more and more difficult situation. Ironically, this time in Spanish history is called El Siglo d'Oro, also eigentlich, so that was a bit of German for you. So the golden time, the golden period, the golden century. But it wasn't really golden. It wasn't really golden for the society, and it wasn't golden for the economy. It did have, in the arts, it did have Cervantes, and it did have Velázquez and other great artists. But the economy went downhill. Spain had 4 state bankruptcies within 100 years, and really only became a great European power again at the end of the 20th century after the death of General Franco. Spain was a country that did not adapt to change, that refused to adapt to change. And you see where this story is going, because if we're looking at muddy little Amsterdam, there the people who had obviously very little to lose had an idea. The traders who had already for centuries been involved in the North Sea trade along the coast suddenly understood that under climate crisis conditions with lots of failing harvests, there was money to be made. You could import grain from the Baltic states and sell it on throughout Europe down to the south of Italy in times of famine, and that was an important pillar of the beginning wealth of Amsterdam. But the story really gets interesting here, because the city fathers of Amsterdam, there was no aristocracy, they were just sort of grand merchants who were ruling the city, and they went a step further. They thought, well, if we are doing international trade already, the route to Asia, the sea route to Asia and to these new countries in the Americas has been opened, and there's enormous wealth to be made there. There are the spices from Asia, the tea and the silk, and increasingly also the cotton, but also in the Americas, and especially in the Caribbean, there are slave plantations that create sugar and tobacco for the European market, and they are enormously lucrative. And so the Netherlands and the Amsterdam traders became involved, like the rest of Europe, in the so-called triangular trade, where cheap European wares were sold in West Africa for slaves brought by African slave traders from the interior. And these enslaved people were then shipped across the ocean. Usually almost half of this human cargo died on the way, and only half of the people made it alive. And they were worked to death very quickly. I think it was on average 8 years on the plantations. And the produce of their labor was the sugar and the tobacco and other products from these plantations that reached European markets and sweetened European tea and coffee, and the great craze for cake and other sweet things that started in the 18th century. Voltaire, the great philosopher, remarked very movingly that there is blood sticking to every bag of sugar that reaches Europe. What he didn't admit, or what he didn't mention, was that he also invested in some of these plantations, and that he did very well out of that. But Amsterdam saw this trading opportunity, and it also understood that you can only run an empire like that if you have people who can read and write and count. Who's going to write the logbooks and the trade correspondences and the packing lists? And who's going to keep the books? And who is going to converse with people in other countries if you don't also know modern languages? And how can you improve your maps without also doing geography and etc.? And here is a huge engine for change. It resulted, for instance, in the foundation of the University of Leiden near Amsterdam in 1572, one of only 2 universities in Europe where you could study not only theology and jurisprudence and perhaps a bit of history and Latin and Greek, but also modern languages and medicine and botany and other things that were relevant for this world. There was another hugely important vector of change, apart from this reinforcing of trade, which also, for instance, happened when the first stock exchange was set up in Amsterdam. There was not an Amsterdam invention, it had already existed in Renaissance Italy, but now even little people in Amsterdam could invest a few guilders in a huge trading venture abroad and kit out a big ship and hopefully profit from the proceeds of these very risky journeys. But so while trade and foreign trade, and with that, of course, also markets and exchange of ideas became very important, it also meant that the world got tougher for many people. You can see that in Great Britain with the so-called enclosure of the commons that Karl Polanyi wrote about quite brilliantly. The commons were areas of common land that existed in many European countries where those peasants who didn't have land of their own could graze their cattle and cut food for the winter and therefore survive. And they usually nominally belonged to a landlord, but they were left as common ground for everyone to use. And now we're talking 15th, 16th century, these commons were all of a sudden fenced in and used to breed sheep for wool, for export, so for a purely commercial venture that was no longer the agriculture that was going to feed the local people. And of course the landless farmers who had grazed their cattle there, they no longer could graze their cattle anywhere, and they had to go away, they had to go into the cities and become the beginning of an industrial proletariat. So things also changed quite brutally, but the foundation of the University of Leiden shows you another aspect of this revolution. And that's, I think, very important, because I've said that really a story had broken down, a narrative had broken down in Europe, and that was the narrative that there was a contract between God and his creatures. And this narrative was disturbed because all of a sudden part of the contract was no longer being fulfilled, and people write about that, theologians write about that, and people are wondering what's happening here. But also the strangeness of nature, which no longer behaved as it did before, inspired people increasingly also to look at nature more closely. You get the first weather diaries in this time, where the weather is noted systematically. You get the first systematic empirical observation of plants, for instance also in the botanical gardens in Leiden, where botanists for the first time ask, well, now that the weather seems to have changed, what plants do actually grow well under these conditions? How can we change agricultural methods to have greater yields and greater harvests? And indeed, they propose successful changes in agriculture, and these changes are proposed in writing in Latin and printed, and can be read throughout Europe. And all of a sudden there's a scientific community, there is something like a public sphere, and there is the creation of empirical knowledge, and we are beginning to see how radically entire societies change in response to a phenomenon that they had not understood, because before these weather diaries, etc., there really was no scientific method that was a culture agreed upon between different actors. And there were no scientific debates. The debates were really theological, and the proofs still came from the Bible, even if you talked about geology. And now, all of a sudden, things were put on a much more empirical footing. But with trade, with the growth of markets, and with the growth of empirical knowledge and of science, came transformation that went further than the economy and than education. Transformation reached entire societies, and the fever of transformation really reached these societies, so that when the effects of the climate crisis finally began to recede in the late 17th, early 18th century, it left societies that had been profoundly changed, profoundly transformed by this experience, not in a systematic way, much more in a trial and error way. And we can see the trial in Amsterdam, and we can see the error in Spain. We can see one culture, one society that reacts entirely out of its own old paradigm and thinks if nature is out of kilter, the solution is to double down on what we've done so far and to reinforce our faith, to reinforce the way this society is working, and not to allow any change to happen, to exclude it all. The other reaction was a very courageous acceptance of change. Amsterdam, for instance, also asked dissidents into the city to work there. So people like Descartes, who were sought by the police in France, and people like Spinoza, who had been exiled from his own Jewish community in Amsterdam, they could work in Amsterdam. Not only could they work, they could also, if they were relatively discreet, teach their ideas, propagate them, and they could also print these books. And forbidden books were printed in Amsterdam and then smuggled back into other European countries for decades, and indeed more than a century to come. So Amsterdam embraced a new world. The Netherlands embraced this change, and while Spain really had a period of decline, we're seeing in the Netherlands the great triumph. Their golden age, het Gouden Eeuw, was indeed an age of enormous political power, where they were the dominating maritime power and also punched far above their weight politically in other European questions. So this is a beginning of an answer to what happened to different societies in times of climate change and how these societies could react to climate change. None of these questions are particularly simple, and none of these questions are one-dimensional. So perhaps the markets helped to even out the imbalance in material terms throughout Europe when harvests failed, but also it created much more material imbalance as the commons were enclosed and as other much more capitalist measures were beginning to be taken in Europe, and the European society and economy changed entirely. How it changed and how this change has impacted our societies until today has indeed shaped them and perhaps also created the crisis in which we are living now, and perhaps even contains the seeds of constructive answers to this crisis. Well, that is a question that I'll be addressing in the next episode of the Blomcast. If you like this podcast, please like it, please subscribe to it, or leave me a comment and tell me what you think about it, what questions you're really interested in, what moments of turning points you find particularly interesting, and I will try to answer your questions, or indeed to record another episode of a podcast about these questions. For now, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to saying hello to you on this podcast again.